Good morning, everyone. I am Matt Keener. I am the Cultural Affairs Officer at the U.S. Embassy here in Manila, and I would like to welcome you all to this roundtable event today. First, I would like to acknowledge all of our esteemed viewers today joining us from government, press, and academia throughout Southeast Asia. I see we have an amazing turnout with lots of very impressive attendees today. Thank you so much for joining us. I know that in these difficult times, as we're all confronting the threat of global pandemic and the stresses associated with home quarantine, that you have a lot of other things on your plate occupying your time. So I appreciate you taking the time to participate in this discussion today. We are honored by your presence, and I hope that everyone out there is staying safe and healthy. The United States is committed to supporting open, transparent, and informed discussions on the most important issues facing the region, whether it's public health, cybersecurity, or maritime security. And for our discussion today, I am delighted to welcome an incredible panel of speakers who represent some of the world's top experts on regional maritime policy. Moderating the discussion today is one of our longtime friends and partners who has spent a lot of time in the Philippines and throughout the region consulting and presenting on this very topic. Greg Pauling is a senior fellow and director of the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Joining him on the panel today here in Manila is our renowned resident expert, Dr. Jay Batambakal, director of the University of the Philippines Institute for Maritime Affairs and Law of the Sea. We are also honored to welcome regional experts to our panel today from Malaysia and Vietnam. Sumathi Permal is a fellow and head of the Center for Straits of Malacca at the Maritime Institute of Malaysia, and Dr. Nguyen Hung Son is the Director General and head of the Institute for the South China Sea at the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam. As we begin our discussion today, I would like to remind all of our panelists that we have a large number of journalists viewing the roundtable today, and this discussion and the subsequent Q&A are all on the record. I would also like to remind all of our viewers today that the views the panelists express during this discussion are theirs alone and do not represent U.S. policy. As I mentioned, once the panelists are done presenting, we will have a Q&A session. So if you have a question for any of the panelists, please use the Q&A feature on the bottom of your screen to submit your questions. Again, the Q&A feature, not the chat feature, please. And please feel free to submit those questions throughout the presentation. Hopefully you all clearly identified yourself when you signed in to the webinar, but we would also appreciate it if you identified your organization when you post your questions, as well as identify which of the panelists you would like to direct your questions to. Questions can also be presented to the entire panel. We will do our best to get to as many questions as possible at the end of the discussion. Now, without further ado, I would like to turn the floor over to our moderator today, Greg Pauling. Greg?
Thanks, Matt. Thank you for the embassy for setting this up and all of you for joining. I want to echo some of what Matt said. I think it's important at this time of isolation and stress for all of us that we get together in whatever ways we can. This is one of those ways, and it's important that whether we're talking about the COVID-19 response that all of our countries are dealing with, or renewed tensions in the South China Sea, which of course have been heavily in the news the last 2 months or so, that in a sense we're in this together. These are regional problems. They're going to require regional solutions. I'm going to try to get out of the way pretty quickly here and let the regional experts talk, and then I'll come in to bookend a little bit with some of my thoughts. But what we really want to have here is a discussion, and we want to leave plenty of time for Q&A and make sure that everybody feels invested in this issue. So without further ado, why don't I open it up to somebody who I'm sure everybody on the call knows, Professor Jay Batambakal. Jay?
Good morning to everyone. Pleased to be here with you all online. At least we're able to do something while we're trying to work out how we deal with this pandemic. Now, I was asked to speak first, so let me just try to summarize what's been happening in past year. Less than a year ago in the West Philippine Sea, on the night of June 9, actually, just a few weeks away now, the Chinese vessel UML Bingyu 42212 hit the Philippine fishing vessel Jember, which is anchored in the area of Weed Bank, about 140 nautical miles from Palawan. Instead of stopping to provide assistance, the Chinese vessel turned off its lights and left the 22 crew members in the water. They would have all died had they not been assisted by a Vietnamese fishing vessel. A Philippine Marine investigation found the Chinese vessel at fault for failing to observe rules on the safety of life at sea, including the obligation, of course, to provide assistance to persons in distress. Now, the Chinese government at first attempted to justify the incident, but months later, the Fishing Association, of which the Chinese vessel was a member, sent a letter of apology to the Philippine government. The Chinese government has never actually officially released its report on the investigation as required by international law and has still not carried out its obligation to make their fishing vessel accountable for its actions. In the months that followed, other incidents took place that showed China strengthening its grip on the West Philippine Sea. In September, it prevented the merchant vessel Green Aura from passing within 12 nautical miles of Scarborough Shoal, demonstrating its control and tightening its grip over the shoal, which had already been receiving wider public attention due to the destructive giant clam harvesting activities conducted by the Chinese fishermen under the watch of the China Coast Guard. The illegal activities of the China Coast Guard were actually um, undertaken with the China Coast Guard's tolerance, if not their protection. And this was captured on video by a media team from ABS-CBN, which today has been shuttered by the Philippine government. For much of the year, China also deployed hundreds of fishing vessels suspected to be maritime militia, and these continuously swarmed the waters around the Philippines' Pagasa Island. And the CCG vessels also menacingly patrolled the areas around smaller Philippine outposts. Meanwhile, hundreds of Chinese fishing vessels were also monitored conducting illegal fishing in the Philippine Exclusive Economic Zone. Now, earlier this year, in February 2020, it was revealed that a Chinese Navy vessel pointed its fire control director at the Philippine Navy vessel BRP Conrado Yap while it was sailing in the West Philippine Sea on a routine patrol and resupply mission. This is the equivalent of a person pointing a gun at another person as they pass by each other on the street. It is a hostile act and an act of aggression that was completely unwarranted and unprovoked. Last March, China further sought to assert its expansive claims by creating two local districts, the Xisha and Nansha districts, both of which include substantial portions of the West Philippine Sea, as well as Philippine territories and jurisdictions within it. Now, against this backdrop, and during this pandemic, less than a month away from the anniversary of that night last year when a Philippine vessel was sunk, the Chinese embassy released a music video entitled Iisang Dagat, which translates to One Sea, ostensibly to celebrate Philippine-China cooperation in the fight against COVID-19. The lyrics portray the two countries as being together, holding hands while afloat in one sea, and expose China's donations of masks and PPE kits and sending a 2-week medical delegation to the Philippines last April. Closer attention to the visuals reveal that it is actually a self-congratulatory video highlighting Philippine officials' gratitude for Chinese benevolence during the pandemic. It actually has nothing to do with the sea. Filipino reactions to this music video, were resoundingly and unabashedly negative. As of today, that video has garnered more than 214,000 dislikes and disapprovals versus only 3,800 likes and approvals. The comment section has been inundated with angry negative commentary calling out the video as nothing less than self-serving propaganda. And this is understandable given the public's knowledge that absolutely nothing that China has done in the past year can corroborate this dreamy trope of two people with hands together while afloat in the ocean. Instead, all these previous actions could be better described as one person pushing the other one overboard. This Isang Dagat music video is an unabashedly good example of how China is trying to take advantage of the pandemic and to use its mass diplomacy to try to undermine Philippine public opposition to its incursions at sea, attempting to send a subtle and subliminal image of benign cooperation and friendship, even while its forces ravage the marine resources of the West Philippine Sea and continue to strengthen and prepare to exclude smaller regional states from their historical and legal heritage in their respective portions of the South China Sea. This pretense and persistence is not lost on certain sectors of the Philippine government, despite President Duterte's penchant for extolling China and accommodating China's requirements for deference and attention. The President's public performative posturing and the formal professional communications and interactions between the Philippines and China is a bit dissonant. But despite perceptions, the professional bureaucracy have done a relatively good job of damage control, as it were, to mitigate the more alarming implications of certain statements and actions. Earlier this year, the Philippines issued a statement expressing support for Vietnam regarding the latter's complaint about the deliberate sinking of a Vietnamese fishing vessel by a Chinese Coast Guard ship, somewhat echoing the Philippines' own experience last year. It submitted a long-delayed note verbal with the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf, softly contradicting China's illegal claim to that extended shelf area, which is also subject to an existing Vietnamese-Malaysian joint submission and its future Philippine submission. So, despite China's claims that the Philippines has abandoned the arbitral ruling in the landmark case of Philippines versus China, the Philippines officially and formally reiterated its adherence to the same in its verbals and statements. Philippine-China relations over the West Philippine Sea, despite China's attempts to portray them as being examples of good bilateral cooperation, have actually been in deadlock when it comes to the most important and most contentious issues. Chinese illegal and destructive fishing in the West Philippine Sea, notably documented in Scarborough Shoal, continued unabated all these years despite Philippine demands that they be stopped. Discussions on joint exploration and development have been pending since November 2018, and so far, the last major development was to be the designation members of the interministerial committees to oversee future negotiations over future areas of cooperation. The real legal discussions, which is the creation of the legal framework and the practical mechanisms for implementing the declaration, not yet been resolved. Now, negotiations on the Code of Conduct have not yet reached a substantial stage and have been delayed even more by the pandemic. And China's recent actions in the South China Sea includes sinking smaller vessels, flexing its military muscle, continuing to build its military bases in practice, confronting the resource exploration and extraction activities of regional states, have also all played an important part in actually undermining trust and confidence and in dampening enthusiasm for a quick agreement. The ASEAN claimants are actually being influenced, albeit incrementally, to move toward more consistent and common positions against China on key issues, notably the adherence to the substance of the award of the Philippines versus China arbitration. This emerging unity provides hope that Southeast Asian claimants will at least come to realize the need for unifying basic common positions to serve as a foundation for dealing with China in the future in a more cohesive and coordinated manner. There has been much talk about a potential reconfiguration of global power relations due to this pandemic, everything from global supply chains, economic relations, and right now it is a bit early to tell how this will directly impact on the South China Sea disputes. For now, what we can see is that China is obviously taking advantage of the opportunities that it provides in order to expand in order to increase its assertive activities. But recent events and the disruption caused by the COVID-19 pandemic may have given a pause for at least some parties, especially in Southeast Asia, to take a step back and reassess their national positions as priorities. Hopefully, when this thing clears a little bit more, we'll see a much more coordinated and much more unified position among Southeast Asian nations when they go back to the table with China. So thank you very much. That's all I'll say for now.
Thanks, Jay. Thank you very much. I know the audio broke up a bit there for some people, so if there's anything you want to ask Jay to clarify in Q&A, feel free to write it in or let us know. I've done enough of these Zoom roundtables the last few weeks to know that usually the recording ends up better than what we hear. So hopefully, what was recorded, people can go back to it and get the full transcript. But for now, let's throw it to Dr. Wen Hong Son from the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam. Son?
The audience. I should first thank the U.S. Embassy in Manila, as well as yourself, Greg Pulling, for putting this panel together at a very interesting time. I think it's very important that we show that business goes on despite the pandemic, and this is doing exactly that. Now, a quick disclaimer, all what I'm going to say is just my personal opinion, and it doesn't reflect my government's. Having said that, I'm going to touch on the questions that probably all of you have in mind, whether China is taking advantage of the pandemic to elevate its claim and activities in the South China Sea. I'll start by some observations, and I'll try to analyze what's going on in China in order to answer that questions. And I'm going to finish by having my thoughts on how ASEAN can possibly respond to the situation. Now, if China is taking advantage of the situation to elevate its claim and activities in the South China Sea, we have certain observations. Now, there might be many of you who would say that while China patterns of activities in the South China Sea has always been as such, and with or without pandemic, this is going to happen anyway. And I do recognize that many activities that we've seen in recent months fall under that category. Activities like the fishing ban is an annual activity. Even the ramming and sinking of the Vietnamese fishing boats is not a first-timer. We've seen that in the past, and it's a regular feature of China's assertiveness in the region, as we've heard from Jay. The Chinese Blue Sea 2020 plan, which they announced earlier in April to protect the South China Sea environment, could seem like a new thing, but many of you would say that they have planned it all along and they would be implementing anyway, with or without the pandemic. The announcement of two research stations in the Ferrer Cross and Subi are also probably have been planned all along, and it's not the thing that came about due to the pandemic, although the pandemic might have pushed them to announce it earlier. The anchoring of the search and rescue vessels in the Ferry Cross is also probably a recurring Chinese activities, and they have planned to do that now that the artificial islands are in place. Even the sending of the Haiyang Giji 08 vessels to Malaysia's exclusive economic zones are not new. We've seen that they have done so last year, and therefore we can expect that it will lurk around the region for some time to come. So these are not new, and certainly China have been doing so in the past, and they will continue. And for many of the reasons, they are pushing these activities towards 2021 at the first 100 years anniversary of the Communist Party establishment. Now, we do see, however, some elevations in China's pattern of activities in the South China Sea. And we've seen that across the board in East Asia and not just in the South China Sea. The Japanese have been recording a 60% increase in Chinese activities in Senkaku/Diaoyu Island since the beginning of this year. That's a substantive increase in Chinese activities in the East China Sea. We've seen an increase in the number of major military exercises by the Chinese Navy in the South China Sea for the first 4 months of this year. Usually compared to the first 4 months of 2019, there were only 3 major military exercises, but we've seen 4 this year. Well, that may or may not explain that they have stepped up their activities due to the coronavirus. Maybe it's because of cheaper gas prices that they took advantage from. But nevertheless, there was an increase in their major military exercises. The announcement of the 2 district provinces in Xisha and Nansha, which is the Parasol and Spratly in Vietnamese and in English, has not been done so in the past 8 years. The last time they did so, the last time they announced the Sansha district was in 2012. largely in retaliation of Vietnam's announcement of its ocean law. But they waited 8 years to do it now for a reason. And the naming of the seabed features, of the submerged features, are also something new that we have not seen for years. So these could be categorized as an elevation of their escalation in the South China Sea. So whether or not these events reflect a change in China policy taking advantage of the pandemic, we are not able to say for certain. What we can say for certain is that China clearly wants to demonstrate that it is unimpeded by the pandemic, and that it is emerging a winner over the pandemic, especially vis-a-vis the United States. They certainly want to demonstrate that whereas the United States operation in South China Sea and other countries' operations in South China Sea might be crippled or might be impeded by the pandemic, China is not the case. China is still operating as usual, and they are even pushing up their activities in the South China Sea. So that's what we can say for certain. We can also say for certain that there are certain people inside China that is thinking that taking advantage of the strategic moment, as they see it, of the pandemic to advance their claims, not only in the South China Sea, but also globally, might be a right thing to do. We've seen that China is doing so, not just in East Asia or in the Indo-Pacific. They've been doing so elsewhere, so in Europe, in Africa, with their mass diplomacy, certainly reflect the thinking inside China by certain corners that this is a strategic moment for China to gain its image and footings in international geopolitics. There are very strong calls within China as well that they should take some actions in East Asia as well. Certainly with Taiwan, we've seen very strong call from certain hawkish views inside China that this is the moment to take Taiwan, this is the moment to do something about Taiwan, to the point that there has to be some other views cooling it down within China itself. There are calls there within China also that this is the moment that China should take actions against those who they blame as taking advantage of the situation to infringe on China's rights in the South China Sea, such as Malaysia or Vietnam. I am quite sure that there are certain views that within China that see this as a strategic moment that China should take advantage of. Whether those views translate into China's official policy, we are not able to say for certain, but certainly it has some impact on China's activities in the South China Sea. What I think might have happened there within China's top leadership is that they see a rising in nationalism within China out of the pandemic, a rising desire to boost nationalism there as well. And they see probably a certain hawkish view, which is not usually tolerated in a normal time, could fit their benefit during the pandemic time. And so the hawkish views might have a bit more leeway or might have more rooms in order to be translated into actual policy within China. We see that during the pandemic, the PLA played a very important role in helping the Chinese top leadership to control the pandemic and to stop the pandemic. And so the PLA's role as well as views emerge as a very strong influencer out of the pandemic. And certainly that might have played a role in deciding events in the South China Sea lately. Whereas those of more moderate views of the probably the Ministry of Foreign Affairs didn't have that much anchoring in Chinese top leadership and didn't translate into policy as such. Those views which calls for better global image for China, internationalist views, or those who call for the respect of international law probably didn't have much traction or influence towards top China's leadership lately. So in that situation, what should be the response from regional countries, particularly ASEAN? As an ASEAN chair, I would say that Vietnam have been trying its very best to try to show that ASEAN's operation is not entirely crippled by the pandemic. We demonstrated that ASEAN still managed to hold its meetings despite the pandemic, and that business still goes on despite the pandemic. And that's a very important message that we sent to, well, to the world, including China. ASEAN has also been able to demonstrate that given the theme chosen by Vietnam this year for its chairmanship, that resilience and responsiveness, that ASEAN was able to respond to a certain extent to developments of events, particularly the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as its implications to the region. So carrying on with its business is what ASEAN needs to do and needs to continue to demonstrate that the regional institution is able to function despite this time of the pandemic. Secondly, I think it's very important to encourage the new trend which we sense from within Southeast Asia countries, particularly those coastal states of the South China Sea, of having greater recognition of the role of the law of the sea, particularly through tribunals' rulings in governing countries' behavior in the South China Sea. Now, the Philippines, after 3 years of keeping it quiet on the tribunal's ruling, this year did a remarkable thing of officially putting the tribunal's ruling back onto its official policy in its note verbal sent to the UN. This is a remarkable event, and we congratulate the Philippines for doing so. It shows that the Philippines has not trashed the tribunal rulings as many suspected. Now, Malaysia, in its UN submissions on its outer limit of the seabed to the UN earlier in December last year, also indicated that it respects the tribunal's ruling and it's aligning its claims with the tribunal's ruling. Vietnam did exactly the same thing with its latest note verbal sent to the UN. It's a recognition and agreement with the rulings of the tribunals. Now, what's remarkable too is that the recognition of the tribunal's rulings also came from non-claimants. Indonesia also officially recognized the tribunal rulings and mentioned it in its official protest of China's activities in North Natuna in January. And that's remarkable. Even Singapore, who has been refraining from directly mentioning the tribunal ruling, also talked about it at the Munich Security Conference. The defense minister of Singapore did talk about it and mentioned the tribunal's rulings by name. So it's very important that, well, the 5 ASEAN countries bordering the South China Sea now talk about or recognize the tribunal's ruling. And ASEAN needs to encourage and promote that trend of relying more on the law of the sea to set and maintain the rules-based order in the South China Sea. What ASEAN needs to do now is properly to encourage Brunei to say something about the law of the sea and the tribunal's ruling as well. So that trend needs to continue. And finally, I think ASEAN, it's very important for ASEAN to also to encourage greater talk on the South China Sea at its meeting and not creating the impression that all that matters are a few words there in the chairman's statement or the joint statement of ASEAN meetings. That is all that is important about how ASEAN handles the South China Sea. We understand the limit of the chairman's statement, but too much emphasis or too much attention has been paid onto what comes out or what words or paragraphs comes out from the chairman's statements about the South China Sea. I think that's not the point. What is being discussed within China's closed door, within ASEAN's closed door, is probably more important than what comes out of it. And the fact that ASEAN builds consensus within closed door is probably more important than the consensus on the few words that comes out from the chairman's statement. And along that line, I think it's very important that unilateralism within ASEAN on the South China Sea needs to continue. Things like greater coordination within Vietnam, Malaysia, Philippines, Indonesia, even Brunei, Singapore on the South China Sea is going to help build this common understanding and consensus within ASEAN on the South China Sea. So let me stop there and welcome the Q&A later on.
Thank you very much, Dr. Son. And now we'll go to Ms. Sumati Permal with the Maritime Institute of Malaysia, sorry, the Malaysian Institute for Maritime Affairs. Sumati.
Thank you. Thank you to the host, U.S. Embassy in Manila, for inviting me and having me at this important meeting. Please let me start with a disclaimer that the views I'm presenting here are my own and does not represent the official views of Malaysia nor my institution. So what I will do for the next 15 minutes or so, I will start by providing some recent development here around our area. Thereafter, I will move on to provide some assessment over the last 10 years. I think Dr. Hun Sen touched upon some broad scenario on, for example, he mentioned about the East China Sea actions by China. Thereafter, I will try to support some of the recommendation made by Jay as well, Dr. Hun Sen. So what we see today, 2020, the South China Sea has been the most geostrategically contested maritime space between China and also other claimants. But what is unprecedented is the number of assets, the large number of assets belonging to China moving into the claimant states EEZ, for example, and during this pandemic COVID-19, where the governments of Southeast Asia and globally are trying to utilize their resources to respond to many other maritime threats, including illegal, non-traditional threats such as movement of people, piracy, illegal movement of contraband, so on and so forth. So this is something that raised eyebrows as what it is not new. China have been conducting unilateral activities for the last since maybe 2009 officially, but as I said, in the case of Vietnam, it was the fishing ban that was recently imposed, and for Philippines, I think it's the sinking of the fishermen boats that is the concern. But on our side is some presence surrounding our oil resource exploration that could potentially was not expected in this time. So Chinese asset belonging to like the survey vessel DZ8, accompanied by Chinese Coast Guard, trawling boat, militias, moving in formation towards made illegal presence, and it's suspected, probably according to the news, that they are conducting a seismic survey, and this Chinese presence, I think it did not actually disrupt Malaysia's activities in the area. Of course, the West Capella have returned after completing. What I know from the news is that it is heading to Labuan after completing its activity for some logistics and documentation purposes. So though Malaysia would have not anticipated such a huge presence of Chinese vessels, I think probably we anticipated some form of presence of Chinese vessels. But at the same time, as I mentioned in my several publications recently, the Malaysian government agencies, the law enforcement, the Royal Malaysian Navy have maintained continuous presence to safeguard our resource, our area, and to conduct surveillance in this area. At the same time, what is also a concern is the large movement of not only the Chinese vessels, but also we know that the US was there, the Australian ships were there, and this is something that, of course, ASEAN have been trying to avoid for many, many years. So with that, I will just move on to show some slides that I've prepared. So this is what I have prepared, some of the string of unilateral actions in the South China Sea since 2009, where China actually submitted formally the 9-dash line, and thereafter from 2010 to 2011, China have included the South China Sea in their defense white paper and South China Sea as their core interest. In 2012, the official announcement of Sansha, or the Hainan, as the administration province for the South China Sea. In 2013, China actually declared ADIS in the East China Sea, and there was so much discussion even within ASEAN and so on about the possibilities of ADIS being imposed in the South China Sea, which have not materialized. In 2014, island fortification, new structures and weapons installed. And simultaneously, in 2015, China announced the OBOR, a very positive proposal to support infrastructure development in Southeast Asia, but it came with some element of security as well. But 2006, there was another important events in the South China Sea, where the PCA actually ruled that the 9-dash line has no legal obligation, no legal basis under the international law. In 2017, we saw China try to re-engage and the ASEAN at the ASEAN level. 2018, mostly it was operationalizing offensive capabilities in the South China Sea. And 2019, we saw mostly exchange of conflict, maneuvering, presence, freedom of navigations by the US, which is not new. The US have been conducting freedom of navigation for the longest time, even, but we saw some exchange of statements officially and also on the ground by China. And here now we are in 2020, where China have actually declared their Blue Sea, which is a combined presence of many, many other Coast Guard, militia, and so on. So over the 10 years or so, what we have seen is the Chinese attempt to exert combine the control of the area, which I will show in the next slide. This is, I think you are very familiar with the statement by the Chinese chairman, the Military Commission's chairman in 1982. From 2000 to 2010, it was to establish control of the waters. In 2010 to 2020, it is actually trying to seek to establish control, which is now being operationalized. And maybe in the future, 2020, this year onwards, it is, there will be intensification of the conflict between US and China, where ASEAN, Southeast Asian countries, or the claimants will be put in a greater pressure. So, so the assessment is China probably is insecure or challenged with some of the Malaysian actions since the quarter of 2019. Dr. Kum Sang also mentioned that Malaysia's submission. Malaysia actually exercised our rights under the UNCLOS to provide partial submission to the at the Commission of the Limit of the Continental Shelf, and also China deployed the survey vessel, probably its attempt to stop Malaysia from conducting our economic exploration through other channels. So I think the survey vessel was conducting observation and survey, but the news says that it did not take any aggressive action. We also anticipate that after the next course will probably a large number of fishing boats coming over to the Southeast Asian shores, and also as I said, the maneuvering of US vessels, Chinese vessels, militias, and also the PLN, the Navy's Chinese Navy Wuhan class could also revoke incidents or ramming. And I think the most important development that ASEAN and Southeast Asian claimants need to address is the announcement of the Blue Sea 2020 and the declaration of Xisha and Nansha as subdivision of Nansha. Probably, although we are not clear of the details, but I suspect that there could be some form of enforcement being done by the Chinese Coast Guard and militia into other areas in the South China Sea. And I think this is what ASEAN should be addressing together. I suppose that there are many ASEAN efforts ASEAN have got a mechanism that in place to address such as marine environmental protection framework that was agreed upon, I think, in 2019. So this is something that we can do. And there are also many forms of proposal coming from different Southeast Asian countries. For example, Indonesia, although a non-claimant, is trying to come on board and join the claimant countries to come up with some proposal or framework to address mainly fishing activities, and also, so here we see there are many three different grouping or multilateral framework emerging. One is among Malaysia, Vietnam, Philippines, the US, and so on. And on the other front, it's Vietnam together with Malaysia and Indonesia in a different area. And here there are also ASEAN-China platform that have agreed to work on countering illegal activities and also fisheries protection. So I think the Vietnam perhaps as a chair could advise or could propose how ASEAN should collectively address this problems. With that, I think I will end my presentation.
Thank you, Sumathi. So those were three great presentations. What I want to do is provide just a few minutes of closing remarks and then save at least 40 minutes for what I expect is going to be a pretty vigorous Q&A. So let me share my screen again very quickly. One thing that I think all three of our panelists agreed on is that solutions are desperately needed, and those solutions are going to have to be multilateral in nature. Neither the Philippines, nor Vietnam, nor Malaysia, nor any other party, including the outside parties, the United States, Australia, Japan, are going to effectively manage the South China Sea, convince Beijing to change its behavior, preserve the marine environment here, and access resources. None of that can be done individually. The only way that can happen is if Chinese leaders come to believe that showing regional leadership in helping to preserve rights and resources provides more benefits to China than bullying its neighbors. And I won't lie, things don't look great right now. The news has been universally bad in the South China Sea for the last 3 months or so. I would argue it's been bad for the last 2 years or so, but it's been much more obvious amid the COVID-19 pandemic. And as Dr. Son referenced, the new nationalism we're seeing from many Chinese officials, the so-called wolf warriors in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who are extremely sensitive and nationalistic at the moment because of the virus, make it very unlikely that China's going to seek compromise anytime soon. But that doesn't mean that things are hopeless. This is the time for the other parties to come together and decide what it is that they believe needs to be done to manage this and present those plans to China with the support of the international community in order to begin moving Beijing toward a more responsible stakeholder role here. Now, just to highlight what's at stake, and I apologize to anybody who's had to see these depressing photos before, but this is what the reef surface around Pagasa Island, Titu Island, looked like in 2016. And this is what the reef surface just a mile and a half away looked like after Chinese clam harvesters finished. This is Scarborough Shoal at the end of 2018 as Chinese clamming boats returned to the shoal. And here are just one of the dozens of piles of dead clams. The South China Sea is turning into a wasteland. It is a boneyard. The vast majority of shallow reef surface in the South China Sea is severely damaged. Some of it is dead permanently. And if there is not cooperation to halt the scale of overfishing, prevent the purposeful destruction of the marine environment like this clam digging, which was specifically called out in the 2016 Arbitral Award, and give the South China Sea marine environment time to repair itself, there will not be any fish left by the time a code of conduct is finished. I'm sure I see the attendee list, a great many friends I know in the media from the Philippines and from Vietnam. I'm sure many of you have heard the heart-wrenching stories of fishers from Palawan, from Luzon, from central Vietnam, talking about the struggles they face, having to go out for weeks at a time to catch juvenile fish farther and farther from shore, playing a dangerous game of chicken with the Chinese Coast Guard to feed their families. Things are only going to get worse. And if there is a low-hanging fruit here, if there is a thing that everybody can agree to, it is the need for marine environmental protection. This is the thing that should be put above all others as the early harvest, the way to prove that progress is possible. Because many of us have grown so cynical after watching 30 years of ASEAN-led failures on negotiating on the South China Sea. That doesn't mean progress is impossible. And I would highlight that at the end of 2018, after Singapore's chairmanship of the ASEAN-China meeting, ASEAN and China signed a declaration of a decade of coastal and marine environmental protection in the South China Sea. All 11 parties, including China, pledged to preserve the marine environment and said they would follow that with concrete negotiations. It has been a year and a half. There have been no negotiations. Vietnam has the chair this year. I would argue that negotiating on that topic, marine and coastal environmental protection, is far more important than whatever talks are going to be held on the Code of Conduct, which anybody who's seen the text knows we already saw this text in 1998 and it didn't work then. So let's press for something a little more real that'll actually preserve the livelihoods of those most impacted. And I would just highlight that this is not impossible. There are legal precedents, there are practical precedents. Marine biologists and fisheries managers know what needs to be done. It is for politicians, particularly politicians in Beijing, to decide to do it. These are the marine protected areas that an expert working group that Jay was part of, that Professor Son's predecessor at DAV was part of, that included Malaysian and Chinese and Taiwanese and Indonesian experts that I led CSIS. Everybody agreed on what you would need to set up a network of marine parks in the South China Sea, and that it could be done legally, and that it wouldn't violate Chinese domestic law. All that is lacking is the political will. And so to badly borrow a quote from Benjamin Franklin, if ASEAN parties do not hang together, they will hang alone here. And let me wrap up with that and open it up to Q&A. We got a couple of questions ahead of time from some of the journalists on the call. So I want to start there. Let me stop the screen share and pop Q&A. So the first is from Willie Reyes with Business World. And Willie asks, for all of the panelists, is there any reversing, I'm going to paraphrase, Willie specifically asked about territorial gains, but is there any reversing Chinese gains to date, or more importantly, tempering Beijing's efforts in the future, which is, I think, what we're all looking at. Is there a way to convince Beijing to modify its behavior? And second, for Jay specifically, what would your recommendations be for a new administration in the Philippines in 2022? Does anybody want to jump on the general question first about changing China's behavior? Jay, you're the only one that unmuted your mic. Does that mean that you're ready to answer?
Oh, I didn't realize. Who will go first? Okay, let me answer the second question first, since it's directed to me. Recommendation for the first for the next administration really is, well, basically what we have been also advocating through that experts group, really to focus on the environmental aspect first as a priority, because that's the one that is in a way sustaining the most damage right now. That's the common interest of all. Everyone will really suffer from the loss of the marine environment in South China Sea. So it should be a priority as far as I can tell. And the rest of the different issues can follow based on whatever cooperation, whatever confidence may be built on getting together about the marine environment. On the on the first question, I think it's not so much a reversal. I mean, that's probably unrealistic at this point. But really, the second one, tempering behavior and hopefully having Chinese behavior change into one that is more in accord with the mutual interests of all the nations around the South China Sea. That's the one that's most important, because right now all the things that China's been doing is pointing towards it moving towards exclusion of everyone else from the benefits and the resources of the South China Sea, because it is trying to gain not only preeminent, but in the future probably exclusive control over the South China Sea and all of its resources. So we need to change. That's the behavior that has to be avoided, and hopefully multilateral actions can still prevent that from happening. We'll turn it over to Dres.
Thank you. Song or Sumati, do you have anything to add?
Well, a couple of weeks ago, we heard that the Chinese Center for Contemporary International Relations submitted a report to top leadership in Beijing, warning of unprecedented international hostility towards Beijing after the pandemic, which indicate how insecure the Chinese leadership feels, and the assessment of the negative strategic environment China is facing at the moment. Now, this is all the consequence of China's own behavior, China's own activities and policy in its neighborhood and internationally. And it doesn't have to be that way. China can create a much better environment and much friendlier international environment through modifying its behavior. China is facing the consequence of its own policy and behavior in the South China Sea as well as internationally. So while no one can convince China to change its own behavior rather than itself, rather than for its own good. So it's very important that we send very clear message to top leadership in Beijing that the international community would like to see a strong and prosperous China, one that is responsible, one that has good policy and friendship with its neighborhood as well as with the international community. And that all depends on China's own behavior.
Thanks. Sumati?
Yeah, if I may respond to the question on possible modification or reversal to Chinese activities, I don't think it's going to be any change of behavior or modification for that matter. In fact, it has been consistent. So as I presented earlier, from 2009, from 2010, up to 2020, and it was consistent from the fishing ban. It is an annual ban that China had imposed in the Philippines, Vietnam. China have been sending coast guard vessels consistently. Maybe the number changes according to their availability and resource matter. But it has intensified, especially in our area. So I think China could become more forceful in imposing the control that it has envisaged for 2020 onwards. And probably I agree with the rest of the panel that they feel threatened because some Southeast Asian claimants are being more vocal, at least on their exercising their rights, and this may actually make China to be more assertive. That is what I see. And what immediately we have to attend to is I know that the COC discussion is something that is ongoing. We have to make sure that the process continues, and also the ASEAN should stay together in order to come with one voice to say that here we are trying to have some negotiation, trying to put the dispute at a lower pace, and to come up with some regional arrangement for fisheries management, and any form of unilateral mass deployment or harassment, if we call, it's uncalled for.
Thanks, Amati. Well, the code of conduct is a good entry into our next set of questions. So we had a few on the code of conduct that I'm going to bundle together. First, Melo Kuna from Asia Pacific Daily and Michaela Del Cayar with GMA News all asked a series of questions on the COC. So let me kind of throw them at the whole panel. First, what do we think of the current status of the COC? Is this going somewhere? Is it substantive, or is it a smokescreen? Second, what does COVID-19 mean for this? Half of the ASEAN meetings have been canceled or delayed. Is this going to suck air out of the effort to negotiate the code or delay it? And what does China's recent activities mean? Are states going to be less amenable to a code of conduct because of the perception that China is becoming more aggressive? Whoever would like to start. Maybe I should throw it to Dr. Son first, but put the impetus on him since Vietnam is the chair this year.
Well, actually, the Philippines is the coordinator of ASEAN-China relationship, and it is the chair of the COC negotiation. Nevertheless, the chair plays a part. I think I was never fully optimistic about the COC negotiating product. I see that the interest of China and ASEAN is not meeting there. And the approach is completely opposite. China takes a historic approach to it, whereas ASEAN takes a more legalistic approach to it. And unless and until the two sides see eye to eye and take a common approach and have the political will to reach some sort of agreement, then there will not be any actual progress. Now things look even gloomier given what's happening in the South China Sea right now. Who would want to go to a negotiation, well, knowing that whatever agreement they would be able to reach in the end is not going to be respected by those on the ground. Therefore, the detachment of what's going on at the negotiation table and what's going on the ground is going to be a very important factor. Disconvincing the parties to go to the negotiation table. So I think it's to salvage the COC negotiation process. China indeed needs to look at its behavior, its activities in the South China Sea, and show its willingness, the political will to create a conducive environment for ASEAN states to be convinced that the COC is still a viable investment that ASEAN needs to put on. Now, the COVID-19 severe the process, at least it's delayed by half a year now, that no negotiation, no meeting on the COC took place, even virtually. And therefore, it's going to further push whatever deadline that ASEAN and China may have indicated on the negotiation process. And so I think things looks even gloomier there. Nevertheless, I think it's still worthwhile to try to attempt to reconnect China on the COC, at least to give the voices that support multilateralism a chance within China to convince itself that it's still something worthwhile doing. And the top leadership in Beijing, its overall calculations of its policy towards the South China Sea will recognize that there's some multilateralism diplomacy going on in the region that needs to be paid attention to, and not the PLN and paramilitia, which all that matter.
Jay, did you want to jump in?
Yes, I agree. No, because of the pandemic, of course, like everything else, the code of conduct has been delayed. But even before then, there were already indications that the negotiations were going to take a little bit longer than originally envisioned, due to the fact that up until the last meeting, the parties had not yet really gotten into the meat of the discussions. Okay? And Vietnam had introduced 4 major topics that were like threshold questions, and that was these threshold questions were supposed to be discussed at the next meeting, which unfortunately has been postponed due to the pandemic. Now, because of that, I'm pretty sure that the original target date for conclusion is just off the rails. No? Was it going somewhere? Is it going somewhere or not? Well, it really depends, I think, on the individual objectives of each ASEAN member state. And that is a problem in the sense that the ASEAN member states have not yet, from my perspective, have not yet really come together to identify where they would want this process to go as a group, what interests there are that they have in common, which they would want to see expressed and protected in this code. No? Based on what I've observed, it seemed like the different states were still putting on the table what their particular interests were, and doing so in a kind of implicit manner through the kinds of text that they were suggesting. No? The lull in the negotiations now might give an opportunity for the different nations to now communicate on this, not try to identify what it is that they have in common, so that they'll be better prepared when they're able to resume as a group. Now, after all, I mean, diplomatic negotiations do not need to be conducted solely through face-to-face conferences. It can be through exchanges of notes, no? And that can be ideal if you're trying to come up with some kind of bilateral arrangements first, come up with agreements with counterparts first, before you move into a multilateral table. So I would suggest that that is one thing that could be done by the different states in the meantime. No? Try to get a sense, just among themselves, between themselves, what their respective interests are and where they can find common ground with each other on a bilateral basis, and then based on that, move on to a larger circle, shall we say, whether it's trilateral until it's a whole ASEAN. What does the COVID-19 mean for the COC? Well, it really depends as well on what takes place. Well, some of it has already been taking place. We've been talking about Chinese activities in the South China Sea while this has been going on. If that kind of negative trend in assertions, shall we say, continues, then by the time this is over and diplomatic activities resume, we could see all this building up into a kind of backlash when things resume. Yes, the states may not be as amenable as before, may not be as open or cooperative as before, especially on these matters related to incidents like petroleum exploration, activities of fishing vessels, the encounters between military vessels. All of these events in the recent months will play into the concerns of the diplomats when they try to resume negotiations. So unless confidence is built up during this period, no, we might see the resumption starting with a deadlock again on many issues.
Thanks. Samati, did you want to weigh in on this one too?
Yeah, just very quickly, I think where it is going, it was a very successful political or diplomatic effort, ASEAN and China, and even before the start of pandemic, there were a lot of voice or concern saying that the COC will not carry much weight in terms of resolving the problems on the ground. And yeah, it could be some weightage in that concern, because as we see on the ground, I think COVID-19 actually have some effect on the negotiation. That's what they have said. Maybe the meetings are not taking place for travel ban and so on. Nevertheless, I think for diplomatic success and also political effort, the COC should continue its negotiation. But the outcome is really, maybe there will be a lot of changes based on what's happening on the ground. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. So we're definitely not going to get through every question that's being asked, but the nice thing about doing this on Zoom is that I can start grouping by theme. So I'm going to put a pin in the COC theme and move on to the legal theme. Jay, Major General Samuel Gattico with the AFP wants to know, given China's non-compliance, is the 2016 Arbitral Award still relevant? What value does it have?
Well, as we've seen, it does have value, even though belatedly the impact has been felt. We've, as already noted by the different speakers, the award was actually raised by all of the ASEAN claimants and even some of the non-claimants. The fact that they are raising it now in the course of diplomatic communications with China is proof that it is still relevant, and that the award does remain to be the basis for possible unity between the different Southeast Asian claimants on how the South China Sea issues should be resolved. That's their, it's like their guidance, no? And if the Southeast Asian issues continue along this track of continuing to invoke the ruling, relying on it, and essentially invoking it as the proper way to allocate jurisdictions, to divide up the South China Sea resources, and to establish cooperation and common ground, then hopefully that will provide a much longer term and much more stable solution, really, to these disputes. We have to keep working on it, and it's really only China which is the one that has been resisting. But one thing is very important to note: it is able to resist because it sees the different Southeast Asian nations as being fragmented. But if they unify, if they come up with unified positions on the South China Sea and begin acting in a coordinated and concerted manner, I can bet you that China will respond, will adjust to that, because they themselves know that they do not want, they cannot have a hostile neighborhood, especially a neighborhood that actually surrounds their entire southern coastline.
Thanks. Let's see, now we have one for Dr. Son. from Minh Tuan with the Hanoi Times. What about the rumors that Vietnam is going to take China to, he says international court, I assume he means Annex 7 arbitration, just like the Philippines did?
Well, the official policy is to use whatever peaceful means available to settle the disputes. And I think that doesn't rule out going to third-party arbitration. Of course, the decision to initiate a court case is a very political decision and rests with the top leadership, to which I am not part of. Therefore, I am not able to say for certain what is being planned there. But the line is that, third-party adjudication is a peaceful mean, it's not a hostile act, and it's in accordance with international law, and therefore is among the options to settle the disputes peacefully with not only with China, but with any other claimants which we have overlapping claims with. But I should like to highlight that that is not the only peaceful means available. There are many other options as well, and all of those are in consideration.
Thank you. Jay, we have another one for you from Milad Apostol with the Committee on Foreign Affairs at the House of Representatives. Do you think it's the proper time for the Philippines to enact the establishment of our maritime domain and designate our archipelagic sea lanes? Referring specifically to the two bills that have been sitting in the Congress.
Zone bill and the archipelagic sea lane bills, which have been pending for a long time. My position has always been that the enactment of these bills should be preceded by the necessary build-up, in a way, of the armed forces' ability to actually protect these waters and surveil these sea lanes, so that any security issues, any problems that we might anticipate and encounter can be properly addressed and managed with the appropriate capabilities and appropriate assets. So I would put that the bills behind the modernization, or at least coordinate the two efforts very carefully, so that we do not end up with these laws being taken advantage of by other more powerful parties with their assets.
Thanks. Okay, now let's put a pin in the legal debate and move on to another topic. So this one comes to Sumati from Dunyat Dang with Toy Train News in Vietnam. Two questions that I'll give you both. They're related. So first, what kind of open and continuous communication, in the word of Foreign Minister Hishamuddin, has Malaysia had with China, to your knowledge, over the West Capella standoff, the drilling incident off Sarawak? And what does Malaysia, I guess he means, what do you think the possibility that China will increase its harassment of Malaysian oil and gas operations in the future?
I think I'm not privy to the discussion by the foreign minister, but the foreign ministry have issued a statement. The minister have conveyed that the South China Sea issues to be dealt by peaceful negotiation and very carefully. And I think the minister have vast experience handling the Ministry of Defense in the past, and Malaysia and China till now enjoys a very good cordial relation. I think that should be the basis for the diplomatic channels to continue the negotiation in order to address, if you call it, tension on the ground. And I think China may not conduct any aggressive action towards Malaysia, but China will continue, this is my assessment, will continue to show interest and continue to monitor our area. That is one. And the question on bilateral consultative mechanism on maritime, I think it is not what I read in the news. It is not what focused on South China Sea, but it is a broad range of maritime domain framework on HADR assistance and so on. And I think Malaysia is open to have bilateral mechanism with the US and many other countries, and this is one option in that our engagement. So I have not come across any particular development on targeting the bilateral mechanism for South China Sea.
So that you ahead, I was about to ask Donna Delino with the NSC's question about the bilateral consultative mechanism. It's nice to see that the majority of these questions so far are coming from friends, old and new, showing that we all still seem to care about this issue, no matter what else is going on. So let's jump to another topic, which a lot of the questions cover, which is the issue of U.S. involvement in FONOPS and whether or not the region finds this helpful. Let me go back to first to Minh Tuan with Hanoi Times, who had a question for me, but I want to broaden it to everybody on the panel, right? Which is, what do we think of the value of U.S. FONOPS and well, I'll broaden it to international involvement more broadly. And so I'll start off with my brief thoughts as the American on the panel, but then what I really want to know is what your read on the regional reaction to U.S. involvement is. And I suspect it's going to be different depending on the country. I've long said, and I think most naval operators and legal experts in the U.S. would all agree, FONOPS are not a solution to anything. FONOPS are a pretty niche legal assertion that the U.S. has been doing since the Jimmy Carter administration. Jay referred earlier, we were talking earlier about the Philippine failure to establish archipelagic sea lanes. Well, every single year just about, the U.S. performs a FONOP through Philippine archipelagic waters because of the failure to establish archipelagic sea lanes. So FONOPS don't uniquely target China. We target the Philippines, Japan, South Korea, most U.S. treaty allies. FONOPS are not meant to alter Chinese behavior in the South China Sea. FONOPS are meant to establish a record that the U.S. doesn't buy into Chinese excessive claims, so that someday, if it's ever necessary, we have a long list to show of all the times we didn't comply. That is necessary, but it's very insufficient. And because it's been happening almost in isolation, there is a sense, I think fair, that the U.S. lacks a larger strategy. The FONOPS have become some kind of symbol of U.S. commitment, and that's a problem because, as I said, they're clearly not sufficient as a problem. It also sends an unhelpful message sometimes that what the U.S. really cares about is U.S. naval freedom of navigation, which is actually why I think it's so helpful, despite the sensitivities around it. I think especially the last two sail-bys of U.S. littoral combat ships by the site of the West Capella was helpful because it signaled that it's not about U.S. freedom of navigation. The U.S. and the entire international community, including the Aussies who were with us when the America did it, care about the right to freedom of the seas, which includes the fishing rights and oil and gas rights of our partners. A FONOP can't protect Filipino fishing or Vietnamese Coast Guard boats or Malaysian oil and gas operations. So we need to move beyond the obsession with FONOPS. Jay, tell me why I'm wrong.
Why? No, I agree, because really FONOPS are designed to protect particular American interests and to preserve a legal situation as far as the U.S. is concerned. It does not necessarily filter out towards for the interests of other countries. Other countries have to do their own FONOPS in order to achieve the same objectives as the U.S., which is to preserve its position with respect to navigational freedoms and freedom and the jurisdictions. I think what we're seeing right now is a problem that the FONOPS are not accompanied by stronger or more visible measures that support the positions in the South China Sea. Even though we see statements, we see these activities happening, we still don't see like an overall concrete economic component or political component that complements this essentially military operations, which signal military interests mainly in the South China Sea. We're not seeing support with respect to, say, environment or economic policies, etc. At least on a regional scale. I'm aware, of course, that the Philippines has been receiving quite a number of aid and assistance on certain environmental initiatives that could be turned towards the South China Sea. But what we need is a broader regional effort, I think, so that the mutual interest of the entire region can really be attended to, and through that unification, that coordination in positions can also be achieved. So, like we were discussing earlier, environmental protection, more effort needs to be put into creating that regional and unified position and actions to protect the marine environment in the South China Sea, especially against the destructive activities of China. As for the reactions, I think the past few years we've seen the reactions of the Philippine government through various spokespersons and even the president and people speaking for the president, and sad to say, it's been rather eyebrow raising, to say the least. But I think overall for the security sector, they can. I think by and large the security sector more or less can appreciate the value of those activities, even if sometimes certain leaders get a bit nervous as well. Yeah.
Thanks. Samathi, can I ask you to weigh in next and maybe bring it specifically to the West Capel, because we also had a question from Philip Hammonds on this issue, which I'll again broaden. I think a lot of people have seen statements out of Malaysia, including from Foreign Minister Medina, that suggest that Malaysia is not all that happy with U.S. involvement, especially the USS America. Malaysia does seem to be okay with the subsequent operations by the littoral combat ships. But what is Malaysia's position on U.S. presence in the South China Sea, and is it the same as China's Coast Guard patrols in Malaysian waters?
I'm not sure whether I represent the entire view of Malaysia. I do not, but my personal take on this. Freedom of navigation connotes is a tool. It's a naval maneuvering of the U.S. Navy. Freedom of navigation operation takes place when in an area where there is incident, usually either in the Philippines or the Vietnam Sea or the Malaysia EEZ, where there is a tension, and the U.S. conduct FNOPS as a way to show that the U.S. can provide a tool to counter some form of Chinese aggressiveness or even Chinese maneuverings in the South China Sea. It is not, I think the UNCLOS does not put a stop or does not disallow freedom of navigation. It is provided under the international law. And my personal view is that though freedom of navigation may not be able to address the problem between China and Vietnam, for example, Malaysia, but at least there is some form of balance, if you would like to call it, or some form of pressure for other assets in the same area. which is not too bad. I think in few years, maybe in 2016 or 20, I can't get the date exactly. In fact, ASEAN have mentioned in their statement that it is not too bad to have U.S. freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. So that is one. So besides naval maneuvering under the pretext of FNOPS, I think there are many other platforms that the U.S. can play a more effective role. For example, ASEAN-US bilateral engagement, the ADMM Plus, and more recently, the Indo-Pacific. Although we have just come, ASEAN have published an outlook on Indo-Pacific, I think that there could be some space or some effort be taken under the Indo-Pacific strategy just to see how the US can play a bigger role or a more effective role on helping the Southeast Asian countries to manage South China Sea dispute.
Thanks, Amati. We're running short on time, but I want to jump to a question from Tuan Wen from Xing News, because I think it touches on an important change in the South China Sea recently. He asks about, or she asked about, the expense, and I add the risk that's being placed on extraction of resources by the claimant states because of China's actions. And so if we think about the harassment of the Koryu 5 drig that Rosneft was operating off Vietnam last year, or now the West Capella, is this going to make it prohibitively expensive and prohibitively difficult for other claimants to do the things that they're legally entitled to? And my sense is that's exactly the point. Malaysia cannot afford to protect every single drilling operation with the kind of deployments it has had to do for the last 6 months now. Vietnam last year at one point deployed over 50 boats, combined between following the Haiyan Daejeon 8 survey ship around and protecting the West Capella. And that's just not a realistic proposition every single time somebody wants to do something in the South China Sea. So if it's a numbers game, China has the numbers. But maybe somebody is a little more optimistic on this front than I am. I don't know. Son, do you have any thoughts?
Well, China has the ambition of taking full control of whatever is there in the South China Sea, at least within the 9-dash line. So it's not just about oil and gas resources, it's also about fisheries, and it's also about their sovereign rights, which they believe it's theirs. So we need to look at the thing from a strategic perspective and not looking at separate incidences and how to deal with them. This is how to deal with China's strategic objective in the South China Sea altogether. So I think it needs a holistic approach. It needs a collective approach from within the region and also internationally. What Vietnam and Malaysia is facing today is going to be very quickly expanded to Indonesia, to Brunei, to the Philippines, and it's going to be expanded to the freedom of navigations and overflight should China be able to, should China be allowed to exercise its four shahs claim, which essentially is going to draw archipelagic baselines along the Spratlys and create a vast area where they would consider it to be internal waters of China without any freedom of navigation or overflight. So everyone is going to be affected, and therefore this needs to be dealt with collectively by the international community, both at the diplomatic level, on the field, as well as on the legal front. So let's just not look at the oil and gas incidents as though China has only interest there. They are creeping from oil and gas to every other field in the South China Sea. So I'd encourage a holistic and look at it from a longer point of view and strategically in order to find a solution.
Thank you, Dr. Son. So this we're now officially over time, but everybody's hanging in there and they keep adding more questions. I'm going to say that we're not going to get to all 13 still open questions. A lot of them involve whether or not the U.S. and China are going to fight a war in the South China Sea. I'm just going to say no for the sake of all of us for me getting to bed tonight and the rest of you starting your days. So let me end with one question for the entire panel, and ask for short answers. This is from Colonel Jamel Espino with the Philippine Air Force. I think it ties into what we were just discussing, the need for all of ASEAN to work together here, because otherwise there's no way that any single claimant is going to preserve its rights given the disparity in power with China. The Colonel uses a play on the name of this panel. What is your projections on sailing a course through contested waters 10 years from now? So I would say, give us some alternatives. Current path, if things don't change, what does the West Philippine Sea, East Sea, South China Sea look like 10 years from now? And what would a more optimistic future look like? Maybe I'll reverse the order. Sumathi, would you like to start off?
Sure. I think in the next 10 years or so, China will seek to impose more control within its 9-line claim, and I'm not sure how the non-claimants are intending to respond to those assertiveness. But I also suspect the Southeast Asian claimants will stand up more forcefully, or will exercise their rights, and also there will be attempt to deal with China on the ASEAN platform, which is the official discussion. Bilaterally, I think there will be a lot of engagement, and also perhaps there will be formation of multilateral, minilateralism, some form of the Southeast Asian country itself coming up some form of framework to deal with China, underlying the projection that China would impose more rules and regulation. We foresee more exchange of, or rather than exchange, I think overlapping rules and regulation in this overlapping area.
Thank you, Sumathi. Dr. Son?
Well, I think the international community now understand that South China Sea is not only an issue of the South China Sea coastal states only. Certainly the order that is set on the South China Sea is going to spill over to the rest of the international community. If China is allowed to dictate what goes on in the South China Sea, then they will dictate what goes on in their business handling in its relationship with the rest of the world, with the United States, with North America, with the European Unions, with the international community. So the rule of law here is what's matter, and that is the interest of the international community. And I'm sure that no one is going to stand idle accepting that international law or international order per se is twisted unilaterally, serving one country's interests with disregards of the interests of the immediate neighborhood and of the broader international community. A global rules-based order is needed and is the interest of all, including one in the South China Sea. I'm sure 10 years from now, we'll see a continued open South China Sea where international law is going to be the benchmark of the code of conduct for every country in South China Sea, China included.
That is a welcome bit of optimism that I think we all need. Jay?
Thank you. I agree with the speaker so far. Now, I mean, if things continue on a business as usual mode, shall we say, where China is simply allowed to get away with its assertions, then what we're going to be seeing in 10 years is basically China's control increasing, both on an in active ways and in passive ways. By active, I mean actually sending out their forces, assets to regulate activities in the South China Sea in the way that they want them to be regulated. Or it could simply be passive in the sense that the surrounding countries then, probably out of fear or in order to maintain good relations with China, they will adjust their behavior, they will adjust their activities accordingly to comply with the requirements and demands of China. If that's the case, then what we'll end up with is essentially the Southeast Asian nations being pushed out or elbowed out of their interests in the South China Sea. And if the region basically, in a way, surrenders and simply adjusts to China's expansions and assertions, then there's not much that the international community can do to help them, because after all, it's the region which is primarily interested, and the extra-regional powers can only provide support. However, if there is a change within ASEAN, particularly, and I think the most important point here is that if ASEAN is able to unify, even just the claimant states, if they're able to unify their positions and come up with their common interests and come up with a concerted or coordinated actions, no, then there is hope for what Sam was mentioning, that it would be China instead, which will now adjust to international law through rules of fair play. It will adjust to the requirements as well of the region, and see the region as an important stakeholder, not just an external, some external factors, or to use the old terms, no, not just barbarians. No, we would like this. We would prefer that this be the path to be taken. No? And as I said earlier, hopefully after this pandemic, due to the adjustments that everyone now will have to make, this can also provide an opportunity to reassess what we want to happen with the South China Sea, to reassess policies again, so that when things start to normalize or stabilize at the very least, no, we will have a better future to work for. And that will be a future that hopefully as well we will find more support from the international community as we try to rebuild from this from the disruption that this pandemic has created.
Thanks, Jay. You have all been extremely insightful. I think everybody on the panel agrees far more than we disagree. And the top point of agreement is that multilateral efforts are key here, whether it is all of ASEAN or a subset of ASEAN. I think we all also agree that the region is at an inflection point. All of the claimants and the international community, including the US, are losing the South China Sea, but it is not lost. It does, however, require action now. And fisher folk in particular are the canaries in the coal mines here. They don't have 10 years. There will be cascading fish stock collapses in the South China Sea in far less than 10 years, unless something's done now. So the moment to take up this fight is now. And with that, let me throw it back to Matt with the U.S. Embassy to take us home.
Thank you so much, Greg, for that outstanding job moderating that amazing discussion. Really, really appreciate your time. I also want to thank sincerely our speakers, our panelists today. Jay, San, Sumathi, thank you so much for joining us. That was a fantastic conversation, very energetic discussion. I also want to extend my thanks to all of our participants. We've been doing a lot of these virtual presentations. We had a packed house today, and I can't say that I've ever seen the participant attendance stay so solid through an entire presentation like that. So that indicates me that there's clearly a lot of appetite for these discussions, and the United States looks forward to continuing to supporting and facilitating these types of expert engagements. And I look forward as well to a time when we can come back and start doing these in person again and bring everyone together. So again, thank you so much. We look forward to future conversations with all of you. And thank you again to all of our attendees today for your participation. I know we probably didn't get to everyone's question, but hopefully we can continue to hold subsequent discussions and get to more of your questions going forward. I do think that we are going to try and post some sort of recording of this discussion via social media. So look out for that as well. So again, thank you so much to everyone. Stay safe and healthy out there. Have wonderful weekends, and we look forward to seeing you again in the future.